I want to introduce to you our speaker today. Dr. Fortunate Parker is interested in the complex relationship between South Africa's indigenous cultures and biodiversity, especially herpetofaunal diversity. He is a postdoctoral researcher at Northwest University, South African Aquatic Biodiversity Institute, and Hazlitt University. He is also a wildlife guide, author, and television producer. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Parker.
Thanks, Deb. Hello, everyone. It's good evening from my side. It's 7 p.m. And also a bit of a disclaimer. My office is on the road between the university entrance and the on-campus bar, and it's practically weekend for the students. So if you hear loud music, promise it's not coming from me. So let's get started. Okay, so I'll be chatting to you about One Health research prospects that I've noticed in South Africa, and as Deb already said, my focus area is the complex relationship between frogs, reptiles, and our cultural diversity. And South Africa is culturally diverse, and it's also biodiverse, and it's really a great place if you want to study anything that jointly looks at biodiversity and culture. And I recently did a systematic literature review to understand the general state of this joint focus on research, and not just frogs and reptiles, but what has been done so far. And one point of this research was that this type of, one point of this literature review was that understanding the state of knowledge in this biodiversity and cultural diversity focus has potential to inform our conservation policies. So this literature review I did looked at where the research is being conducted, which field does this research fall into, and which taxa is this research focused on. And once I understood that, I could also look at the results and the discussion and the recommendations of this research and understand, are there any social or conservation benefits from this, this research with a joint focus on biodiversity and culture. And so first gonna quickly go through the result, and then I'll come back to explain what One Health prospects I saw from there. So this research is mostly focused on the high biodiversity areas of our country. And it's transdisciplinary, which is great for the One Health research focus. But it has a very high focus on human health sciences, and that's because a lot of it is looking at traditional medicine use, and I guess that's the type of research that you can monetize, so maybe people are going for that. Yes, it is transdisciplinary, but the relevance to One Health is really low. So when I looked at it, the amount of research that could be said to be relevant to One Health is less than 10% of all the research that I reviewed. And because of the high focus on traditional medicine, there was a very high focus on plants, which sadly, for me, for my research focus, there wasn't that many reptiles, and there was a very low focus on amphibians. I would have preferred if there was more, but this just means I'll have to do some of that work now. Benefits derived from this research. Some of the research just looked at just tested whether these traditional remedies were useful or not, or useful in terms of can they heal people or not. And some of them didn't bother making recommendations. Some of them benefited people, and some just made recommendations on how to improve future research. And all in all, there was, again, less than 10% of, if you look over there and you look over there, was less than 10% of the research could be said to be relevant to One Health. So the problem with this unevenly high focus on traditional medicine is that it creates this misconception that the nature-based culture students are basically utilitarian, which is actually not the case. There's a lot of spiritual uses or spiritual relevance of wildlife in South African cultures. And because this knowledge base can inform policy, it might end up promoting policy that promotes utilitarian use of wildlife, and that would not be ideal because it would overlook, for instance, people that look at wildlife in a spiritual way or have kinship with wildlife. So I'm going back to those slides and looking at the One Health prospects. From the spatial focus, because it mostly focused on this area, which is high in endemic wildlife. Most notably, the Cape Floristic region is in this area, and South Africa's biodiversity increases that way. So all along here is high biodiversity spots, which is where all these papers that I reviewed were focused on. So if we want to bring One Health research in there, we could incorporate wildlife and ecosystem health in addition to looking at human health sciences. So we would say, for example, looking at plants and say, okay, so these plants are used for this health purpose, and yes or no, they do have antimicrobial activity, but what's the wildlife impact of using this specific plant? And what's the ecosystem health of using this, ecosystem health impact of using this specific plant? And then again, it basically goes back to what I said earlier. Why, if for One Health research purposes, we could ask, why is the wildlife and ecosystem implications of traditional medicine use not being looked at? And because usually when you say, okay, there's too much focus on human health science, it's a question I got from the reviewer. So there was too much focus on human health science, and the question was, well, are you saying people shouldn't focus on human health science? I'm saying, no, let's continue focusing on human health science, but let's bring in all these other elements that would make it a bit more rounded study. So let's bring in conservation ecology aspects in this traditional medicine use. So we're already looking at ecosystem services, but let's look at ecosystem impacts of using plants for traditional medicine. And there were a few papers looking at animal health. So that, depending on what traditional remedy you're looking at, you could also bring in animal health aspects. Again, this links back to the previous slide where there's a high focus on plants and traditional medicine, but what about all these cultural practices that use animals, fungi, and non-abiotic components? For instance, for some of the churches, their spiritual connection is in nature, so their church would be held outside in nature, so that's in a non-abiotic use of nature that has spiritual health impacts, if you will, and you can take something like that and also look at what's the impact on that environment that they're using. So yeah, there you go. And so on the outcomes, when you try to bring in all these different aspects, you'd be able to amplify the research so that it contributes to both social items and because we always get asked, but what is this? What's the point of this research you're doing? Is it going to inform policy? So if we do amplify the social and conservation objectives of this research that's looking at nature-based cultural practices, it has potential to inform socially inclusive conservation planning. And what this means, it doesn't, conservation is not looked at from the perspective of wildlife only. So we are not, when you look at conservation, oh, we're not saving wildlife, but we are protecting wildlife and we're protecting the benefits, human benefits, or human well-being, as the South African law puts it, human well-being elements of conservation. And in that way, it becomes a bit more socially inclusive than it is currently. So when we look at the broader picture that I got from this review that I did, is that One Health in South Africa is really underexplored. Just this morning, I went on Google Scholar and looked at published research that has the words One Health and South Africa in their titles, and the result I got was only 11 publications. Of course, that doesn't mean there's only 11 One Health publications in South Africa. It just means the research that mentions this in the titles is very low. Is the prospect to increase focus on One Health? Yes, there is, and it wouldn't be something completely radical, but also completely new. You could just connect to the human health science that's already being undertaken and that's focused on nature-based cultural practices, and bring in implications for wildlife and bring in implications for ecosystems, so that you end up having a really well-rounded research project that would fit into what the One Health research focus is about. What are the challenges? Well, it's time consuming, but not in the sense that it takes a lot of time for you to do the actual research. That's a given, because you now have split focus. But from experience, you're going to need, in South Africa specifically, you're going to need separate ethics approvals for your work. So one animal health ethics approval, and then one human health ethics approval. And from my previous study, it took me 18 months just to get that paperwork sorted, and then I could actually start doing the research. So you need to budget a lot of time prior to doing your work, and we don't have that time usually as researchers. And also there's because this joint focus is so new, there isn't a dedicated ethics committee for it, and there are no protocols on how to assess such research. So you'd end up having to split it into remove the animal aspects and put them one side, and then remove the people aspects and put them one side, and then send them to their separate committees, and then later on come back and combine them again, which is less than ideal. Personally, I struggle to find funding for any research that focuses on nature-based cultural practices. And funders are just a bit careful of the intellectual property that comes with looking at traditional cultures. Of course, there are safeguards like the Nagoya Protocol, which I have clearance for in my studies. But still, even with those safeguards, funders are just going to say no if they see that you're looking this closely at traditional cultures. And I think at this point, this is going to be the end, and I'm going to open up to discussions, which is by far the favorite part of what I do.
Okay, great. So we have a lot of time for discussion because this is what Dr. Parker loves to incorporate into his presentations. Does anybody want to start? And you can just unmute yourself if you do. Okay, I will start if nobody else wants to at this point in time. So can you speak directly to your experience with looking at indigenous cultures and herpetofauna, which is your specialty?
Sure, there's a lot to discuss there, but what I found I was able to, when looking at these nature-based cultural practices and norms that relate to frogs and reptiles, I could put them into at least 10 categories, from your traditional medicine, from your symbolism, from even your storytelling to your poetry. So it's this whole spectrum that you can look at, and depending on your field of interest, you can just pick from there. So what I'll be doing now is I'll be looking specifically at the traditional medicine aspect of it, and also looking at the part that can be incorporated into conservation planning, because usually with South African cultures, what if you ask around about South African cultures, it's, oh no, South African cultures and reptiles, no, they kill reptiles on site, which is actually not true. To give you an example, we have a mole snake in the Xhosa cultures would never kill a mole snake, to a point where they would set up a wood pile in the corner of their yard specifically for that snake, and that snake is seen as part of the family. So stuff like that is what I need, I'll be looking into to say, okay, look, cultures use wildlife, but cultures also protect wildlife. So it's not this one-sided view that's currently been what's known in South Africa. And to also bring it back to One Health research focus is going to be really difficult. But I need to look at what is the human health benefits or even risks of using frogs and reptiles, specifically eating them, because there's a few turtles and toads and snakes that are eaten, and crocodiles also. And to my surprise, there's one parasite in crocodiles that can accidentally make people its host. So something like that is really worrying in terms of all those noted problems that we are facing. So just going to incorporate that and look at, okay, so look, is there any health benefits or are they health risks? And then once that's done, that's just two categories that I'm looking at. Once that's done, and if I'm not too old, I can look at the other categories there are.
Well, I know here we have a hard time with, I shouldn't say a hard time, but there's often that the general thought that just like what you showed, human health is people tend to equate it with one health, and not understanding that just looking at the cause of somebody being sick, like, okay, they have a virus, or okay, they broke their leg, or okay, they are, I don't know, it could be a million things. They, instead of, they look at specifically that direct cause and think, well, one health, if they're then saying, oh, well, we need to have a radiograph and a surgeon, and versus looking much deeper than that to see how everything fits together. What are the factors that contributed to that human health issue? What are the, just surrounding them? What's going on in their environment? What are they being exposed to, or what, just, we never look further, beyond that. And I think what you showed us is very similar to what we could see anywhere. But if people would start looking at things in more of a One Health framework, I think that we would be able to tackle some of these problems a lot better than what we are. Can you speak to that? I think you already did, but can you speak to it a little bit more?
I think it's a problem we have here also. So One Health in our any One Health focus in our campus specifically is non-existent. We're at a stage where we're discussing introducing a module, not even close to having an entire stream of One Health. And if we're discussing it now, so it's probably going to take 3 years before we have at least one class that's related to One Health. And it most at people's health, and it stops at that. And it's very difficult to try and say, okay, yes, One Health, it means human health. That's one of the boxes. Now let's look at the other box, which is wildlife, and then after that, we look at ecosystem health also. And it's not an easy one to do, especially as an early career research, to raise my hand and say, no, Professor, you're doing it wrong. But I think we'll eventually get there. But it's quite difficult. The way I try to explain is we are. So South African law says we protect the environment for human well-being, and I think they put it so nicely, because if you have a really well-functioning ecosystem, then it provides better services for people. And just trying to work from our law as a point of departure, which we have very nice laws, but the enforcement is horrible. So going from that as a point of departure, I think I might be able to sort of stop this, not stop, that's a strong word, but reduce this one-sided focus on human health and saying, okay, that's One Health, and try to bring in the wildlife and ecosystem part of it also.
We do have a question in the chat. I guess you can see it.
Yeah, so given conflicting priorities in developing countries, how do I demonstrate immediate benefits of your studies to rural participants and communities? Weirdly enough, that's the easy part. it's trying to convince my colleagues that this study is worth it. But with any community or participant, what I usually go to when I speak to them and try to get them as participants, I usually go to them and ask them to teach me about nature, basically. And then once they teach me, I ask, is it okay if I share what I think? And then from there, so trying to understand their view of nature gives me a way to sort of frame my outputs. A practical example is when I went to a community in KZN and asked them to teach me about frogs, I noticed there was an interest in frogs. And there were also a lot of observations of frogs that people might call myths. But those are just observations explained without knowledge that I was taught in biology class. And immediately I could say, okay, so if you participate in this study, what you will get out of it is a book on frogs of your area written in your home language based on this discussion that we're having. And in that way, I could immediately show the benefits of this sort of holistic view on research. And this new research that I'm doing, which is specifically going for traditional medicine markets, there my angle is telling the traditional health practitioners they have a really bad relationship with conservation enforcement in South Africa. And the way I am approaching the situation is that ask the practitioners to work with me on this research. And this research becomes a way of informing legal planning around traditional medicine and try to ease the relationship between them and our law enforcement. And in a way, if I can do that, and also I told them that I was going to test their medicine to see if it actually works or not. So for them, basically, I'm trying to be an ally and saying, okay, if you help me, I'm going to try and ease your fights with conservation law enforcement. I'm going to test this medicine that you're using for you. And it does get complicated when I try to bring that into my department and say, I want to do this research. And they want to say, it doesn't seem like it's worth it. But generally from communities, they are very happy to participate once they see that I have a really open approach and I frame it as a mutual learning experience and not me going there and teaching them about wildlife, basically. I hope that answers the question. I said a lot of things there.
Any other questions or points of discussion? Are you networking with, throughout Africa or just within your country?
Throughout Africa or wherever I find a person that's willing to collaborate. And through this future, there's a program called Future Leaders of Amphibian Conservation, which has a lot of researchers from different developing countries. And so through that network, I can say, okay, this is what I'm doing. Who's interested or who has any type of work that's closely related to what I do, so we can sort of work together, but generally not thinking about who I collaborate with. Deb, I wanted to ask, how complicated is it to work on traditional cultural knowledge or indigenous knowledge in the US? Because I've never worked on such a research for a US researcher.
That's a good question. I guess I'm going to ask, is there anybody on the Zoom who does this? I know that we do have actually several faculty here at UT, but also throughout. So I'm not really the person to ask that, to answer that question, because I don't know how difficult it is. I know that there's a lot ongoing. For example, I know here on campus, we actually have an Indian mound that there's been a lot of, it's preserved. Anything that gets built is built around it. And so there's a lot of increased awareness, and I think that's growing. Like what I was sharing with you before we started, I'm hearing even more in the news, more reports, more awareness within communities about trying to bring to light the traditions, whereas it used to be more like we would just, those are things of the past. But now I feel like we're really looking at cultures, and especially looking at indigenous cultures, and taking note from the standpoint of learning about how they're doing things and what's worked in the past, so that maybe we can start incorporating some of those as well, because a lot of what we're doing has not been working. And we're just realizing that we need to pay attention and learn from things that have been tried and true, instead of trying to just assume that they're not worth doing. Let's see. Oh, here.
Okay. So while I think of a response for this, the reason I asked that question is because a lot of the justification for focusing on nature-based cultural practices, the benefits of that are based on studies from the US and Canada, and there's very few on the African continent or other developing countries. So that's very interesting. To answer Michael's question, how communal land would work? It would have like, we can divide it into two blocks. So it would be the residential block, let's just call it that, where most people would live. And these vast areas around communal lands, which some of them are untouched, they're used for hunting, and some of them have been converted to mixed agriculture. In the residential units, you'll find very few herpetofauna that are not adapted to living near people. So the common snake there would be a brown house snake, which is non-venomous. It usually gets killed on sight. So most snakes get killed on sight in the residential block. But it's a safe haven for your tropical house geckos and your striped skinks, which thrive in residential areas. So they like those sort of places. But besides those two species in this, that's called a residential block, there you won't find much herpetofauna. In the sections that are used for hunting, it's very seldom that the hunting will go out specifically looking for frogs or reptiles, unless it's bullfrog season, which is generally 1 month in the year. And then that's when there's a huge uptake of frogs, mostly male frogs. And African rock pythons also get targeted a lot, but that's because once they eat something, they lay there for a couple of hours or even a day to digest before they move them off. So in this, it's called the hunting block. This is not official classification, it's just something to sort of simplify the structure of communal lands. So in these hunting blocks, I'd say about 5 species would be heavily impacted. So besides the python and the bullfrogs, they would go for the leopard tortoise, either because it's a big animal that they can eat, or is also used for traditional medicine purposes. And then they would also focus on monitor lizards, both the rock monitor and the Nile monitor. So in those areas, other frogs and reptiles are sort of safe, but these 5 species get really hammered a lot. And then coming to the farming blocks, there it's the usual story where so the savanna or whatever natural habitat is there gets cleared, and they start plowing a mixture of crops, which usually includes maize, peas, and sometimes watermelon or gourds. They also won't find that many frogs or reptiles. What I do find in that area is your chameleons that basically come there looking for the agricultural pests. So I think the general impact on herpetofauna is not that big when you look at a communal area, but specific impact on these 5 species that get targeted in the hunting blocks and the snakes that get killed in the residential area is sometimes worrying, depending on the size of the communal area in question. Cormac Price, disclaimer, he's from my okay, so from a parasitology point of view, do you think you could establish a working relationship with the rural communities who harvest wildlife for food, so as to survey for the presence of zoonotic parasites such as stomatids, tongueworms, for example? Yes, Cormac, that is by far the easiest part of this research. Going to communities and establishing a relationship with them is really easy once you get the approach right. And this is something that I gladly help other colleagues with, trying to establish relationships with communities. But you will have a really hard time clearing, once you make that relationship, you will have a really hard time clearing the study with our ethics council, because it's, if you're looking at parasitology, then you go into human health aspects, and getting approval for a human health study is a pain. Cheers, Cormac. So any other questions, comments? Marcy Souza, you are welcome. I hope I pronounced your name right. Sorry if I didn't.
Can you speak just a little bit more on how do you convince, I know you've touched on this, but how do you convince people, landowners, of the value of wildlife that might be eating their crops, or they might just think that they're nuisances?
That's a difficult one, especially farmers. If you have farmers and you try to convince them of the value of any wildlife, a major problem near the Kruger National Park is elephants, and they are not having any of it. And around the reserves also, you have these apex predators that once in a while would go over the fence and go into these very expensive hunting farms that have this weird mix of animals that they are selling out to hunters. And once the predator kills their stock, they kill on the side. So it's difficult with larger animals, but it's easier with frogs. That was really interesting, to a point where there is a researcher called Dr. Jean Tarrant, who's affiliated to our research group, who is able to convince farmers to leave frogs alone. And these frogs have now become bragging rights for the farmers to say, oh, I have a Western leopard toad on my property. Oh, I have this frog on my property. So the cute little animals, it's easy to do, but the larger wildlife is difficult. And there was with predators where they were winning farmers over to say, okay, we will introduce these dogs that will look after your livestock and keep away the predators. If we do that, will you stop killing the predators? And the landlord was, yeah, say, and that worked in a way. So I guess sort of try to find out a mutually, and no, it won't be mutual, an arrangement that benefits the farmers more than anyone else, and then it works out. Laura, Liane, thank you. Michael, is it easy to collaborate with other departments in your university concerning One Health? Do you have a unit encouraging such collaborations? Yes, I would say it's easy to collaborate within the university. And even outside the university, like the previous previous research I did was in collaboration with the university from Belgium, and that was easy. The only thing they asked for was that we have a legal contract that governs the relationship, and after that they were hands off and said, okay, the study is up to you. Yes, we do have a unit. It's called the I think it's called Innovation Office, where if you have this collaboration between departments, you can go to them and say, okay, this is what we're trying to do. Please give us money. And they did that with this book that we wrote for frogs in the Zulu language. And they said, okay, I will pay for the translations. This is a very nice collaboration between herpetology and language studies. So the university is very, very encouraging of these type of collaborations.
I would like to be able to go and just ask for money and they say, sure.
Yeah, I think I was really lucky that time. I don't think it'll happen again.
Nice. Okay, well, we are reaching 10 till, so unless there's like another question or comment. Thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you for being here and for talking about your work. I think you have like a website or something too, don't you? Or I can't remember. But some things that
Yeah,
we can post.
it's a website where it's so I try to have outputs in my research that are not scientific outputs. So I started this website called Wildlife in Vernacular, where the idea is to present herpetology, as much of it as possible, in the 9 official indigenous languages that we have. So in that way, it's constantly putting out, basically trying to make herpetology fun for people that are generally excluded from herpetology. I'm not looking after it as much as I should, but I'll try to change that.
Nice. Yeah, well, if you we can post that website if you want on ours, and then people can see some of your work. So
I'm just gonna put the link in the chat also.
okay, awesome.
There's one last question from Michael. How do you incorporate sustainability of the projects involving communities, for instance, ensuring that the initiatives continue beyond? Sure. So I try to sort of build on what I'm doing, which is doesn't always work out. So to give you an example, my research focus started in one corner of a province in South Africa, and it mostly focused on language aspects. And from there, I could amplify and go to the rest of the country and not just look at language, but try to look at traditional medicine and your poetry in these norms and practices. So how I do it is I try to amplify whatever I'm doing. So usually when one research project concludes, it throws out a ton of questions, and I try to build on those. One thing that does happen is sometimes you lose the connection with the community, or you don't speak to them as often as possible, and that is something that is difficult to fix. Give you an example. One community that I'm working with would take me 10 hours to drive there, and there is no financial means to keep that going. So Wildlife in Vernacular is a way of trying to sort of keep the outputs flow into the community, even though I don't get to see them. And for communities that don't have internet access, it's basically trying to write books in their language. If I can't write books because that takes forever to do, then try developing these posters that can get taken to schools, that would present herpetology in the local languages and not just English, which is the dominant language in South Africa. And in that way, I try to sort of sustain the outputs towards the communities. And when we speak strictly sustainability, the work so we have this, our legislation says we should cater for every cultural practice and every person, but we're not doing that. We're just focusing on wildlife. So with my research, it's how I see it is that it sort of provides info that can be plugged into conservation planning to say, okay, so this part of conservation planning that we've been avoiding, here's info, we can plug it in, and we can, when we speak of sustainability, the focus is generally on wildlife. With this part, I can say, okay, but wait, you've been missing this part, and this is what I've dedicated most of my work to. So let's try and improve our approach to the sustainability legislation that we have and keep into it, which we're not really doing at this point.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, thanks everybody.
Thank you for joining.